The Johnson family lived in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and small brick houses. 15-year-old Tyrell was a sophomore at Lincoln High School, known for his kind smile and quiet determination. He wasn't the most popular kid, but he had a small group of loyal friends who appreciated his honest nature and quick wit. Tyrell's father, Michael Johnson, worked as a special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. For 12 years, he had investigated hate crimes and civil rights violations across the country. A tall man with serious eyes and a warm laugh, Michael believed deeply in justice and had dedicated his life to making sure everyone was treated fairly under the law. At home, though, he was just Dad, the man who made terrible pancakes on Sunday mornings and fell asleep watching old movies on the couch. Tyrell's mother, Lisa, worked long hours as a pediatrician at Children's Memorial Hospital. Her gentle hands had helped countless sick children, and her patient explanations had comforted worried parents. With her natural confidence and caring nature, she balanced out Michael's sometimes too serious approach to life. 3 months ago, their family had grown by 4 paws when they adopted a German Shepherd from the local animal shelter. The dog had been found wandering near the highway, skinny and scared. The shelter workers had named him King, but Tyrell renamed him Thunder because of how the dog was afraid of storms. Thunder would hide under Tyrell's bed whenever rain clouds gathered, shaking until the boy would crawl under there with him, speaking softly until the fear passed. It didn't take long for Thunder to become Tyrell's shadow. Every afternoon when Tyrell came home from school, Thunder would be waiting by the door, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook with happiness. They developed their own little routines, morning walks before school, training sessions where Thunder learned to sit, stay, and give his paw, and quiet evenings with Thunder's head resting on Tyrell's lap while he did homework. Despite living in a fairly safe neighborhood, dinner conversations in the Johnson house often turned serious. Michael had seen too many cases of racial profiling to stay silent. He would tell Tyrell, "It doesn't matter that I carry an FBI badge. When I'm just a man on the street, some people see my skin first and everything else second." So Michael taught his son the hard lessons early: how to speak respectfully to police officers, to keep his hands visible, to ask permission before reaching for anything. "It's not fair," Michael would say, "but it's the world we live in, and I need you to come home safe every night." Lisa would watch these conversations with sad eyes. She wanted her son to just be a teenager, to worry about homework and basketball tryouts, not whether someone might see him as a threat. But she knew her husband was right. Their son needed to understand the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. Even with these serious talks, the Johnson home was full of laughter. They hosted barbecues where neighbors gathered in their backyard. They had game nights where Lisa's competitive streak made everyone laugh. Michael told terrible dad jokes that made Tyrell groan and roll his eyes. And now they had Thunder, who seemed to smile with his whole body and who had never met a person he didn't immediately love. On Friday nights, they often ordered pizza and watched movies together. Thunder would try to sneak pieces of pepperoni when no one was looking. Tyrell would pretend not to notice. These simple moments, just being together, were what made their house a home. No one in the family could have imagined how quickly their peaceful life was about to change. How one ordinary Saturday morning would shatter everything they knew. How Thunder's trusting nature and Tyrell's dark skin would collide with fear and prejudice in the worst possible way. Saturday morning came with perfect weather, not too hot, not too cold, with a few puffy clouds drifting across the blue sky. Tyrell woke up early, excited to take Thunder to Oakwood Park. It was their favorite weekend ritual. The park had a special fenced area where dogs could run free, and Thunder loved nothing more than chasing tennis balls and making friends with other dogs. Tyrell pulled on his favorite red hoodie, the one his grandmother had given him for his birthday. He filled his water bottle and grabbed a few dog treats from the kitchen jar. His parents were still asleep, his dad had come home late from work, and his mom had the rare luxury of a Saturday off. "I'm taking Thunder to the park," Tyrell called out, leaving a note on the fridge just in case. Thunder was already by the door, his leash in his mouth, tail wagging in anticipation. The walk to the park took about 15 minutes. Tyrell put in his earbuds, listening to his favorite playlist while Thunder trotted beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff an interesting patch of grass. An old woman working in her garden waved at them, and Tyrell smiled and waved back. It was just an ordinary morning. When they reached the park, it was fairly empty. A few joggers on the path, a couple of other dog owners in the distance. Tyrell took Thunder to the fenced dog area and checked to make sure the gate was secure before unclipping the leash. Thunder looked up at him, waiting for permission. "Go on, boy," Tyrell said, and Thunder took off, racing around the perimeter of the fence, burning off energy with pure joy. Tyrell laughed, watching his dog run. There was something so honest about Thunder's happiness, so uncomplicated. Tyrell sat on a bench and took out his phone to check messages from his friends. They were planning to meet up later for a basketball game at the community center. He was typing a response when he heard the sound of a police car pulling up nearby. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars often drove through the park. But then he noticed two officers getting out, their hands already on their weapons. They were moving with purpose, scanning the area. Tyrell felt a cold knot form in his stomach. His father's words echoed in his head. One of the officers, a tall man with a crew cut, pointed in his direction. "That's him," Tyrell heard him say, and both officers began walking toward the dog area. Tyrell stood up slowly, his heart beginning to race. He remembered what his dad had taught him: stay calm. Keep your hands visible. Be respectful. "Thunder," he called. "Come here, boy." But Thunder was on the far side of the area, fascinated by something in the grass. The officers reached the fence. The taller one, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, spoke first. "Is that your dog?" His voice was sharp, accusatory. "Yes, sir," Tyrell answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "His name is Thunder." The second officer, shorter and younger, had his hand on his holstered gun. "We got a call about a suspicious person with an aggressive dog." Tyrell felt confusion mix with his fear. "Thunder isn't aggressive, sir. He's friendly. We come here all the time." Thunder had finally noticed the newcomers. Always social, always friendly, he bounded across the grass toward them, his tail wagging hard, tongue hanging out in a doggy smile. "Call your dog back." Officer Daniels suddenly shouted, drawing his weapon. "Thunder, stop." Tyrell yelled, panic flooding through him. But it was too late. Thunder was running full speed, excited to meet new people. "He's friendly. He's just being friendly." Tyrell cried out, starting to run toward his dog. The sound of the first gunshot froze him in place. It seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. Then came two more shots, quick and final. Thunder made a terrible yelping sound and then collapsed on the grass, his body twitching once before going still. Tyrell couldn't breathe. The world seemed to slow down around him. A strange ringing filled his ears. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. He ran to Thunder, falling to his knees beside his dog. Blood was spreading across Thunder's beautiful fur. His eyes were still open, but the light in them was already fading. "No, no, no," Tyrell sobbed, gathering Thunder into his arms, not caring about the blood soaking into his hoodie. "Please no." He looked up at the officers through tears. Why? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just being friendly. Officer Daniels had already holstered his weapon. His face showed no emotion. The dog was charging at us. I perceived a threat. People were gathering now, drawn by the gunshots. Someone was filming with their phone. A woman was shouting at the officers. And Tyrell just held Thunder, rocking back and forth, whispering to him as the life drained from his dog's body. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry." He didn't resist when the officers pulled him away from Thunder's body. He didn't fight when they put handcuffs on him and led him to the police car. He couldn't feel anything beyond the enormous hole that had just been torn through his heart. Tyrell sat in the back of the police car, numb with shock. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but he barely felt them. Through the window, he could see Thunder's body, now covered with someone's jacket. A small crowd had gathered, and people were shouting at the officers. Someone was comforting an elderly woman who was sobbing. She had witnessed everything. The younger officer was talking into his radio, his face tense. Officer Daniels stood with his arms crossed, looking annoyed rather than concerned. Neither of them would look directly at Tyrell. Tyrell's phone kept buzzing in his pocket, but he couldn't reach it. His friends were probably wondering where he was. His parents had no idea what had happened. The thought of his mom and dad made tears well up again. "Can I call my parents, please?" Tyrell asked, his voice cracking. Officer Daniels glanced back at him. We'll handle that at the station. But I didn't do anything wrong, Tyrell said, struggling to keep his voice steady. The younger officer looked uncomfortable. We need to follow procedure, he said, not unkindly. We had a report of a suspicious person with a dangerous dog. Who called it in? Tyrell asked. Who said Thunder was dangerous? Neither officer answered. Another police car arrived, and a woman officer stepped out. She spoke briefly with Officer Daniels, then looked over at Tyrell in the car. Whatever she said made Officer Daniels frown. Meanwhile, more people had gathered. Someone was holding up a phone, clearly recording everything. Another person was shouting about police brutality. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman officer walked over to the car and opened the door. I'm Officer Rivera, she said. Her voice was firm but not harsh. I'm going to ask you some questions, okay? Tyrell nodded, not trusting himself to speak. What's your name and address? She asked. Tyrell Johnson. I live at 1842 Maple Street. How old are you, Tyrell? 15. She wrote this down, then asked, Can you tell me your parents' names and contact information? Tyrell gave her his parents' names and phone numbers. My dad works for the FBI, he added, not sure if it would help or make things worse. Officer Rivera's pen paused. Your father is with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Yes, ma'am. He's a special agent in the Civil Rights Division. Something shifted in her expression. She closed her notebook and said, Wait here. As if he had a choice. She went back to the other officers and a heated discussion followed. Tyrell couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see Officer Daniels gesturing angrily while Officer Rivera stood her ground. Finally, she came back to the car. I'm going to take those cuffs off now, she said, reaching for her keys. We're not charging you with anything. The relief of having his hands free was immediate. Tyrell rubbed his wrists, wincing. What about Thunder? He asked, his voice breaking. What happens to him? Officer Rivera's face softened slightly. I'm very sorry about your dog. Animal control will come to take care of things. But you can call your parents now. With shaking hands, Tyrell pulled out his phone. 7 missed calls from his friends. Nothing from his parents. They probably thought he was just at the park, having fun with Thunder. He called his dad first. The phone rang 3 times before Michael answered, his voice casual. Hey son, having fun at the park. And just like that, Tyrell broke down. Through sobs, he managed to get out, Dad, they shot Thunder. The police shot him. He's dead, Dad. Thunder's dead. There was a moment of stunned silence, then Michael's voice changed completely. Where are you exactly? Are you hurt? What happened? I'm at Oakwood Park. By the dog area. They thought Thunder was dangerous, but he wasn't, Dad. He was just running to say hello. Tyrell could barely get the words out. I'm coming right now. Stay on the phone with me. Put me on speaker if the police want to talk to me. Officer Rivera was watching Tyrell closely. Is that your father? She asked. Tyrell nodded and held out the phone. My dad wants to talk to you. She took the phone, and Tyrell could hear his father's voice, controlled but with an undercurrent of barely contained fury. This is Special Agent Michael Johnson with the FBI. Who am I speaking with? Officer Rivera identified herself and explained the situation as she understood it. Tyrell heard his father ask sharp, precise questions. Who made the call? What was the exact nature of the complaint? Why was his son handcuffed? What was Officer Daniels' badge number? By the time the call ended, Officer Rivera's face had lost some of its color. She handed the phone back to Tyrell. Your father will be here soon, she said. True to his word, Michael arrived in less than 10 minutes, parking his car haphazardly and sprinting toward Tyrell. The moment he saw his son, his face crumpled. Tyrell ran to his father, and Michael wrapped his arms around him, holding him tight as if he might disappear. I'm so sorry, son, Michael whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I'm so sorry about Thunder. Over Tyrell's shoulder, Michael stared at the officers, his eyes burning with a cold fury that made even Officer Daniels look away. This isn't over, Michael said, his voice carrying in the now quiet park. Not by a long shot. The Johnson home felt empty without Thunder. His water bowl still sat in the kitchen corner. His favorite chew toy lay abandoned on the living room floor. No one had the heart to put his things away yet. Michael sat at the dining table, surrounded by papers and his laptop. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. Since the incident 2 days ago, he had barely rested. Lisa brought him a cup of coffee and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You need to sleep," she said softly. Michael shook his head. "I'll sleep when I get justice for Thunder. For Tyrell." On the couch, Tyrell scrolled through his phone, looking at pictures of Thunder. In every single one, the dog was either playing, sleeping, or looking adoringly at Tyrell. There wasn't a single image that showed anything but a gentle, loving pet. "Dad," Tyrell called out, his voice still raw from crying. "The videos from the park are all over social media now." Michael looked up sharply. "What videos?" "People were recording. It's gone viral." Tyrell's voice cracked. "Everyone can see what they did to Thunder." Michael came over and sat beside his son. Together, they watched the clips that had been shared thousands of times already. From different angles, the videos showed the same thing: Thunder running happily toward the officers, tail wagging, and then the sudden, shocking violence of the shooting. The footage clearly showed Thunder wasn't aggressive, he was just being a friendly dog. "This is good," Michael said, his jaw tight. "Evidence." The doorbell rang, and Lisa went to answer it. She returned with a tall black woman in a sharp suit. "This is Vanessa Taylor," Lisa said. "She works with Michael at the bureau." Vanessa nodded at Tyrell with sympathy in her eyes. "I'm so sorry about what happened to your dog," she said. Then she turned to Michael. "I've pulled everything I could on Officer Daniels. It's not pretty." They spread files across the dining table. Vanessa pointed to several reports. 3 previous complaints of excessive force, all involving young black men. All dismissed without proper investigation. "Why is he still on the force?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with anger. Vanessa sighed. "Police union. Protective supervisors. The usual story." Michael's phone rang. He checked the caller ID and frowned. "It's Chief Wilson." He put the call on speaker. "This is Special Agent Johnson." "Agent Johnson." The police chief's voice was carefully neutral. "I wanted to personally express my condolences about the unfortunate incident with your son's dog." Michael's face hardened. "Unfortunate incident. My unarmed 15-year-old son was handcuffed and his dog was shot dead for no reason." There was a pause. "We're conducting an internal review." "Save it," Michael cut in. "I've officially requested all body camera footage, dispatch recordings, and the original 911 call. I expect them on my desk by tomorrow morning." "That might take some time to process through the proper channels." "I don't think you understand, Chief." Michael's voice was deadly calm. "This isn't going away. The videos are already all over the internet. My son was targeted because of his skin color, and his dog paid the price. So you can either be part of the solution, or you can become part of the problem I solve." After he hung up, Tyrell looked at his father with new eyes. He'd always known his dad was important at work, but he'd never seen this side of him before, the fierce, uncompromising agent who fought for justice. "Do you think they'll actually give you the recordings?" Tyrell asked. "They don't have a choice," Michael replied. "And if they try to hold back, that just makes them look worse." The next morning, a package was delivered to Michael's office. Inside were USB drives containing all the footage he'd requested. He brought them home, and the family gathered around his laptop. First, they listened to the 911 call. "There's a black teenager at Oakwood Park," a woman's voice said, sounding nervous. "He's got a big German Shepherd that looks really aggressive. I'm worried something bad might happen." The dispatcher asked for more details, and the woman added, "He's wearing a red hoodie. The dog doesn't have a leash on. It's running around wild." Michael paused the recording. "She called because you're black and had a German Shepherd. That's it. Can't we find out who called?" Lisa asked. "Already working on it," Michael said grimly. The body camera footage was even worse. From Officer Daniels' perspective, they could clearly see Thunder running toward them, tail wagging. There was nothing threatening about the dog's body language. Most damning of all, they could hear what Officer Daniels said to his partner just before they got out of the car. "Let's see what this kid is up to." Bet you $10 the dog's not even registered. Tyrell winced. The casual prejudice was like a slap. Later that night, after Tyrell had finally fallen asleep, Michael and Lisa sat in the kitchen, talking in low voices. "I have to recuse myself officially from the investigation," Michael said. "Conflict of interest. But I've got friends at the Bureau who'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves." Lisa reached across the table for his hand. "What do you think will happen?" Michael's eyes were hard. "Best case? Officer Daniels loses his badge. The department faces a consent decree. Real reform happens." He paused. "Worst case? They close ranks, issue a statement about following procedure. Nothing changes. And what about Tyrell?" Lisa's voice broke. "How does he ever trust police officers again?" Michael had no answer for that. The wound was still too fresh, the pain too raw. But as he looked at the evidence spread across their table, he made a silent promise to Thunder, to Tyrell, to every kid who'd ever been seen as suspicious just because of their skin color. This time would be different. This time, there would be justice. By the end of the week, the story had exploded. Local news stations ran segments about Thunder's shooting. Social media was flooded with the hashtag Justice for Thunder. Somehow, in death, a German Shepherd had become a symbol of something much bigger. The Johnson family couldn't even go grocery shopping without being recognized. People would approach them, often with tears in their eyes, to express their support or share stories about their own pets. Some would talk about their own experiences with police bias. The outpouring was overwhelming. "I never wanted to be famous," Tyrell said quietly one evening as they watched another news segment about the case. "Not like this." Lisa put her arm around her son. "I know, honey, but sometimes life chooses us for things we didn't ask for." The doorbell rang. Michael answered it to find their front yard filled with people holding candles. A woman stepped forward, introducing herself as the head of the local community center. "We wanted to hold a vigil for Thunder," she explained, "and to show your family that you're not alone in this fight." Michael was speechless for a moment. Then he nodded, emotion making it hard to speak. "Thank you," he finally managed. The Johnsons stepped out onto their porch. Hundreds of people stood in their yard and spilled into the street. People of all ages and backgrounds, holding candles, some with their own dogs on leashes. Many held signs, "Justice for Thunder" and "End Police Violence" and "Black Lives Matter." Someone had set up a small memorial with Thunder's picture and flowers. Children had placed drawings of dogs and handwritten notes. An elderly man played Amazing Grace on a saxophone, the notes floating into the night air. Tyrell stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight. A lump formed in his throat. He had been so consumed by his own grief, he hadn't realized how many people cared. People began sharing stories about beloved pets, about frightening encounters with police, about the need for change. Their voices formed a tapestry of shared experience that was both heartbreaking and deeply human. Finally, someone asked Tyrell if he wanted to speak. At first, he shook his head. But then, looking at all those faces turned toward him with such support, he changed his mind. His parents stood beside him as he stepped forward. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice. Then he began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with growing strength. "Thunder wasn't just a dog," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet night. "He was my best friend. He made me laugh every day. He slept under my bed during thunderstorms because he was scared. He never hurt anyone." Tyrell paused, taking a deep breath. "The police saw him as dangerous because they saw me as dangerous. They didn't see a kid with his pet. They saw a threat that wasn't there." His voice broke a little, but he kept going. "I don't want anyone else to lose their dog, or their brother, or their son because someone in power looked at their skin and made up a story about who they were." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Some were weeping openly. Michael and Lisa watched their son with a mixture of heartbreak and pride. "Thunder deserved better," Tyrell concluded. "We all deserve better." The vigil lasted late into the night. By the time the last person left, the Johnsons were exhausted but somehow lighter, as if sharing their grief had made it a little more bearable. The next morning, they woke to find the memorial had grown. Someone had left a carved wooden statue of a German Shepherd. Others had brought more flowers, dog toys, and notes of support. As Michael was heading to work, his phone rang. It was Vanessa from the bureau. "You need to turn on the news," she said without preamble. Michael switched on the TV. The local news was showing a protest outside the police station. Hundreds of people had gathered, many with dogs, demanding accountability for Thunder's death. Similar protests were happening in other cities too. The camera showed a group of mothers with their children, holding signs about keeping their kids safe. There were dog owners talking about their fear of walking their pets. Community leaders calling for police reform. "This isn't going away," Vanessa said over the phone. "The public is outraged." Michael watched the screen, a mixture of emotions washing over him. "Good," he said finally. "It shouldn't go away." Later that day, Tyrell received a message from his school. The student council wanted to organize an assembly about police relations and community safety. They asked if he would be willing to speak. Tyrell showed the message to his parents. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, "but I think I should try." Lisa hugged him tight. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to." "But Thunder can't speak for himself," Tyrell said quietly. "Someone has to tell his story." That night at the dinner table, Michael shared some news. The police department has scheduled a press conference for tomorrow. Apparently, they're going to address Thunder's shooting. Will they actually admit they were wrong? Lisa asked, skepticism clear in her voice. Michael shrugged. "We'll see, but either way, we'll be there. All of us. They need to look us in the eye when they talk about what happened." Tyrell nodded, a new determination in his eyes. The shy, quiet boy from before was changing, forged by grief and anger into someone stronger, someone who understood that sometimes you have to stand up and make your voice heard. For Thunder, for himself, for all the others who had lost their voices. "Let's do it," he said quietly. For Thunder. Later that day, Grace filed the lawsuit. By evening, it was breaking news. The police union responded immediately with a statement defending Officer Daniels and claiming he had followed proper procedure. But public opinion had already turned sharply against them. The videos of Thunder's shooting had been viewed millions of times. The story had gone national. Celebrities were tweeting about it. Other families were coming forward with similar stories. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, the grand jury convened to hear evidence against Officer Daniels. Tyrell was called to testify, the first time he had told his story in an official setting. He sat in the witness chair, his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. But when he began to speak, his voice was clear and strong. He described that morning at the park, Thunder's excitement, the sudden arrival of the police, the terrible sound of gunshots. Tears streamed down his face as he recalled holding his dying dog, but he didn't stop, didn't falter. When the prosecutor asked him if Thunder had ever shown aggression to anyone, Tyrell shook his head. "He was scared of vacuum cleaners and thunderstorms," he said. "He would hide under my bed during storms. He slept with a stuffed duck every night. He wasn't dangerous." The grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning an indictment against Officer Daniels for official misconduct and animal cruelty. That evening, the family gathered in their living room, watching the news coverage of the indictment. The reporters stood outside the courthouse, explaining that Officer Daniels would be arrested the following morning and would face arraignment. "What happens next?" Tyrell asked his father. Michael sighed. "A lot of legal proceedings. The criminal case. House civil lawsuit. The FBI investigation. It's going to be a long road. Will it make a difference?" Tyrell's voice was small, uncertain. Lisa sat beside her son and took his hand. "Change happens slowly, piece by piece. But yes, I believe this will make a difference." On the TV, they showed a clip of protesters outside the police station, many with dogs, many holding signs with Thunder's picture and the words "Never again." Michael pointed to the screen. "Look at that, son. People are listening. People care. That's how change begins." Tyrell nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. Thunder was gone, and nothing could bring him back. But maybe, just maybe, his death could mean something. Could help protect other families, other pets, from the same pain. For the first time since that terrible morning at the park, Tyrell felt the faintest glimmer of peace. 6 months had passed since that terrible morning at the park. Autumn had given way to winter, and winter was now melting into spring. The Johnson family had lived through the darkest period of their lives, but like the changing seasons, things were slowly beginning to transform. Tyrell stood in the center of a newly dedicated dog park, surrounded by community members, journalists, and several city officials. A polished stone memorial stood at the entrance, a carved German shepherd with the words "Thunder's Park," where all are welcome, engraved beneath it. "I never thought anything good could come from losing Thunder," Tyrell said, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "But looking at all of you here today, I see that wasn't true." The journey to this moment had been long and difficult. Officer Daniels' trial had lasted 3 weeks. The courthouse steps had been crowded with protesters every day, people demanding justice, people supporting the police, media from across the country. Inside, Tyrell had testified again, looking directly at Officer Daniels as he described what had happened to Thunder. The defense had tried to paint Thunder as aggressive, tried to suggest that Tyrell had somehow provoked the situation. But the videos told the truth, so did the other witnesses. And finally, so did Officer Daniels' own record of complaints about racial bias. In the end, the jury had found him guilty of official misconduct and animal cruelty. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison and permanently revoked his law enforcement certification. He would never be a police officer again. The civil lawsuit had been settled out of court. The city had agreed to pay a substantial sum to the Johnson family and, more importantly, to implement a comprehensive set of reforms within the police department. The settlement money had been used to create the Thunder Foundation, dedicated to providing therapy dogs to traumatized youth and advocating for police reform nationwide. Today's park dedication was the Foundation's first major community project. "This park is for everyone," Tyrell continued, looking around at the faces watching him. "No one will be seen as suspicious here because of their skin color. No pets will be seen as dangerous because of their breed or size. This is a place of safety and joy, the things Thunder brought to my life every day." Michael and Lisa stood nearby, pride and sadness mingling on their faces as they watched their son. The past 6 months had changed Tyrell. He was still quiet in many ways, still preferred books to parties, but there was a new confidence in him, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He had spoken at schools across the city about his experience. He had met with police academy cadets to help them understand the impact of bias. He had testified before the city council about the importance of the reforms they were now implementing. The changes in the police department were already visible. Every officer now wore a body camera that couldn't be disabled. They had all undergone training on recognizing and countering implicit bias, on de-escalation techniques, and on safely handling encounters with pets. The screening process for new recruits had been completely overhauled. Most significantly, a civilian oversight board had been established with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. Michael had been asked to serve on this board, bringing his FBI expertise to bear on creating a more just system. As part of the FBI investigation, the department had entered into a consent decree, a legally binding agreement to implement specific reforms and submit to federal monitoring for 5 years. It was a major victory for accountability. After the ceremony, people brought their dogs to try out the new park. Tyrell sat on a bench, watching the animals play. An elderly woman approached, a small brown puppy tucked under her arm. "My grandson told me your story," she said, sitting beside him. "I'm sorry about your dog." Tyrell nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "This little one needs a home," she continued, nodding at the puppy. "She deserves someone special." Tyrell looked at the puppy, who was watching him with curious eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "Nobody's ever ready for love after loss," the woman said gently. "You just have to be brave enough to try again." She placed the puppy in his lap. The little dog immediately licked his hand and then curled up contentedly. Later that evening, the Johnson family sat in their living room, watching the tiny puppy explore her new surroundings. "What will you name her?" Lisa asked. Tyrell watched the puppy pounce on a toy. "Hope," he said after a moment. "I think Thunder would like that name." Michael smiled, resting his hand on his son's shoulder. "Thunder would be proud of you, you know, not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become." Tyrell nodded, feeling the familiar ache of missing Thunder, but also something new. A sense that his pain had created something meaningful, something lasting. Outside, spring flowers were pushing up through the soil, bringing color back to a world that had been gray for too long. Inside, a small brown puppy named Hope was beginning to feel at home. It wasn't a perfect ending. Thunder was still gone. Racism still existed. The world was still unfair in countless ways. But change had happened, real, measurable change that would protect other families, other pets. And in that change, in that progress, Thunder's spirit lived on.